which is an independent organization in Vienna. There are many other centers for Israel studies, but this is the one in Vienna, which is dedicated to presenting informative talks and discussions about what is going on in Israel from multiple disciplinary perspectives, and makes a point of being independent, that is, not being affiliated with any religious or political organization. That allows us to seek different sponsorships for each talk according to whoever is involved in the topic in question, and that has turned out to be a very useful way to proceed. Today, our speaker is Einat Wilf, who is a graduate of Harvard University from her bachelor days, and that's why, as you will hear, that her English sounds a bit American. Maybe it comes from that. And studied at INSEAD in Paris, and also received her PhD in political science from Wilson College in Cambridge. So you can say she's had a very wide background, internationally speaking. The PhD was on the World Jewish Congress's campaign against the Swiss banks, but since then, she has entered politics for a time. She was in the Knesset for 3 years with the Labour Party, Avodah, and co-founded a new party, which, however, did not enter the Knesset elections. She's now an author and independent political consultant, and has become an authority on issues of Israel, Zionism, foreign policy, and education. Among her books are Winning the War of Words, Essays on Zionism and Israel, published in 2015. I'm going to quote from one of her essays in that book, perhaps later in the discussion, if that seems to be appropriate. Telling Our Story, Essays on Zionism in the Middle East and the Path to Peace, and most recently, The Struggle for Return, just published in German as Der Kampf um Rückkehr, wie die westliche Nachtsicht für den palästinensischen Traum den Frieden behindert hat. Translated into English, how Western mildness, so to speak, with respect to Palestinian dreams, one might also say illusions, has been an obstacle to peace. A very provocative thesis already in the title of the book, which is perhaps why it's been translated into German. It just came out. Congratulations. And that is in part the occasion for this talk, but the Israeli elections are also, in fact, the primary occasion for this talk. So I have asked Einat to try to couple these two things if she wants to and can. This broader thesis about the, shall we say, mildness of the West toward Palestinian illusions could be a possible explanation, if applied to Israeli politics, for the collapse of the left. At least that was a thesis we discussed and that you seem to agree with. So if you will, I think it would be great if you would say a few words to us about both things, and to the extent that you want to combine them, and then we'll have an open discussion. The best way to do that, I think, is for people to use the chat function on Zoom. If you know where that is, just raise your hand, and that way we don't have interference with the sound, with everybody being unmuted. But if that doesn't work, we'll see how we can handle it in other ways. In any case, Einat, welcome. It's a shame that we can't have you here. It was just too short notice. We might remedy that another time. And so welcome, and please begin.
Thank you. Thank you, and it's a real pleasure to be with you here. So yes, I would very much like to tie the few things together. The current Israeli political situation, and we'll discuss at the end kind of what it means, what it could mean. But like many things, you need to go deeper and further in order to understand how we arrived at the general collapse of the Israeli political left. And for me, this is a very personal thing because I came from, and I continue to be of the Israeli political left. I grew up in Jerusalem. I grew up in a neighborhood that everyone voted for the Israeli Labor Party. We are talking about the 80s, 70s, 80s, 90s. This is a period where the Labor Party even though it's no longer an exclusive control of Israeli politics. It is a dominant party in Israeli politics, tends to command, together with its satellite parties, at least half of the Israeli Knesset. And when the Labor Party kind of moved away from socialism, it was actually very successful in reinventing itself as the party of peace. And for a while, it had a very compelling message. The message was that Israel has a path to peace, and the path to peace is actually quite simple. Now, a word about why Israel even needed a path to peace. As I'm sure you know, when Israel is born, we're actually getting on the day, tomorrow is November 29th, the partition resolution, when the war actually begins. When Israel is born, after the war that begins in November 29th until 1949, from 47 to 49, at the end of the war, the Arab armies, the Arabs of the land, are unsuccessful in their declared and open goal of preventing the Jewish state from coming into being. But the fact that they failed in that war does not mean that they accept its outcome. Actually, they reject the outcome, and they make it very clear that the most they're willing to do is to sign ceasefire agreements with Israel. None of the countries around Israel, Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, Egypt, are willing to make peace with Israel. They're only willing to sign ceasefire agreements, which is when people speak about the pre-1967 borders, it's actually a wrong name, because borders require agreement of both sides to the borders. Israel does not have a single border when it's born, because it only has ceasefire lines, except the ocean, of course. So Israel doesn't have peace when it's born. In 1967, the ceasefire ends. I mean, there were always kind of various skirmishes, but in 1967, the Arab armies make their second major attempt to undo the state of Israel. And this time they fail even more spectacularly. And within 6 days, Israel comes to command territory 3 times the size pre-1967, the Golan Heights in the north, the Sinai Peninsula in the south, and of course the Gaza Strip and the West Bank in the center, from Syria, from Jordan, from Egypt. Now Israel has all these substantial territorial assets, and this thinking begins to develop that Israel now has a path to peace. And the path to peace is based on a very simple formula called land for peace. Israel will hand over the land that it captured in 67, and in return, Israel will finally have peace, the peace that its neighbors refused to make with it when it was born. And this was a very compelling idea, because it promised peace, which is what Israelis wanted, and it said that there's a very simple way to get there. And with that, the Israeli left was able to reinvent itself in the 80s and 90s as a very attractive political party and idea. And the 90s was really the decade of land for peace. Now, of course, land for peace was a very successful idea before. This was the basis for the peace agreement with Egypt. Israel hands over the entire Sinai Peninsula in return for an agreement with Egypt that was called peace, and we can later discuss how much of it is really peace. But officially, it was a peace agreement in return for land. The 1990s, though, are really the decade of land for peace. Israel elects twice Labor Party left-wing governments, Rabin and later Barak, with the express idea of land for peace. They negotiate with the Syrians over the Golan Heights. They make peace with Jordan when Jordan gives up its territorial claim to the West Bank. And of course, the highlight of the 90s are the direct negotiations with the Palestine Liberation Organization, the PLO, over the future of the West Bank and Gaza, with the idea that ultimately there will be a Palestinian state and peace between Israel and Palestine. Like many Israelis of the political left, the 90s were a time of euphoria. The handshakes on the manicured lines, the peace agreement with Jordan, the negotiations, Ehud Barak going to Camp David. There was really a sense that kind of gelled with the general feeling of the 1990s. You know, the Soviet Union just collapsed, the Good Friday Agreement in Northern Ireland, apartheid came to an end in South Africa. So there was a real feeling in the 90s that a lot of old problems could be resolved, including making peace between Israelis and Arab countries and Palestinians. And this was really a sense of euphoria. Like many Israelis of the left, we were thrilled when Ehud Barak went to Camp David. And Camp David, of course, was symbolic. This was where peace was negotiated with Egypt. And Ehud Barak puts on the table a proposal that addressed all the issues that we were told were the obstacles to peace. So what are we told were the obstacles to peace with the Palestinians? First and foremost, of course, the occupation, Israel's military control of the West Bank and Gaza at the time since 1967. Israel didn't annex most of the territories. It controlled them via the military, which meant it was officially occupied. So people said, we got to end the occupation. Very well. Barak's proposal was about to end the occupation. Israel would withdraw. There would be an independent Palestinian state in Gaza and the West Bank. It would have independent borders with Egypt and Jordan. That would end Israel's military presence. It would end the occupation. So if the occupation is the reason we don't have peace, that was going to be over. The next obstacle is the settlements, right? We're told the settlements are the reason we don't have peace. Well, settlements were going to be either removed or exchanged for equivalent land. So the state of Palestine was going to emerge as a settlement-free Palestinian Arab state. No Jewish presence, no Jewish settlement within the state of Palestine. So if we're told that settlements are the reasons we don't have peace, as the obstacle to peace, well, that was taken care of. That was off the table. Jerusalem, we're told, is an obstacle. People forget how far-reaching Barak's proposal was. Jerusalem was going to be divided, not just the secular Arab neighborhoods and Jewish neighborhoods, but even the 1 square kilometer, which I fondly call Insanity Central, even that 1 square kilometer was going to be divided. So holy sites were going to be under Palestinian sovereignty, and Jerusalem was going to be divided. So all the obstacles to peace were removed in Barak's proposal. Everything we were told for decades is that the Palestinians are a people fighting for freedom, to end the occupation against the settlements, to have a state of Palestine with a capital in East Jerusalem. All the Palestinians had to do was say yes. What do? They walk away. Arafat walks away in 2000. Abu Mazen walks away from a similar proposal by Ehud Olmert in 2008. They walk away. And not only do they walk away to no criticism from their people. Now, if you were to believe that Palestinian society is divided on this issue, and there's a lot of voices, and the leaders don't represent the people, you would expect at least to see one op-ed by a Palestinian living in London. You know, if you're saying Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza cannot speak freely, it's not true, but let's say this is your explanation. There was not even one op-ed by a Palestinian living in London saying, are you crazy? We could have had our state go back to the negotiating room and say yes. So Arafat and later Abu Mazen walk away from clear, concrete opportunities to end the occupation, to have a Palestinian state without settlements, with capital in East Jerusalem, and they're not criticized for walking away, meaning that by walking away, they knew they were fulfilling their people's wishes. And not only do they walk away to no criticism, what follows, of course, is a campaign of bloody massacres and violence, especially in 2001, 2, 3, what is misnamed the Second Intifada. You will remember it, the buses being exploded, the people in hotels and cafes, entire families just blown to bits for going to eat pizza. And that was weeks and months after the Palestinians could have had everything we were told they wanted. So a lot of Israelis of the political left, like myself, began to ask a very simple question. What do the Palestinians want? What do they want? Because they clearly don't want to end the occupation. They could have had that and they didn't take it. They clearly don't want an end to the settlements. They could have had that and they didn't take it. They clearly don't want a Palestinian state. They could have had that and they didn't take it. So what do they want? Now, they might want all of these things, but there's something that they want so much more that they're willing to walk away again and again and again from those other things because there's something that they want more. And Adi Schwartz, my co-writer for the book, and myself discovered, amazingly, that to the Palestinians' credit, they were telling us all along what they wanted. The answer was staring us in the face. We didn't listen to what they said, or when we did listen, we didn't take them seriously. They wanted what they've always wanted, from the river, from the Jordan River, to the sea, to the Mediterranean Sea, a single Arab Palestinian state, no Jewish state in any borders whatsoever. That's it. To their credit, they've been consistent for a century. We just wanted to believe otherwise. Now, this is what the book, The War of Return, is devoted to. The book traces the whole development of the idea of Palestinian refugees and why we have refugees till the present, generation after generation. And the answer of the book at the end is quite simple. The reason that we still have an ongoing Palestinian refugee problem, unlike any other war from the 1940s and 50s, is because from the Palestinian perspective, the war of 1948 is not over. It's not over. And as far as they're concerned, one day they will still win it. The war that they have been waging for the last century to prevent and hopefully to dismantle a state for the Jewish people between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, they believe that war could still be won to their cause. And I will say in parentheses, you said illusions. It's not irrational. Sometimes, I meet with many European journalists and diplomats. I've invented a word to what they call it. It's called West-planing. They say that the Palestinians cannot be serious. They can't really believe it. They can't really believe that millions of Palestinians will settle in Israel and turn it into an Arab majority state. And I always give them the same answer. I'm like, open a map. That's what Palestinians do every day. Open a map. The Jews are a tiny, tiny, tiny ethnic, national, religious minority in an Arab and Islamic Middle East. We have always been a minority. No matter how many babies we make, no matter how many Jews make Aliyah, we remain a minority. That's never going to change. So from the Arab-Palestinian perspective, they look at the Jewish people trying to maintain a state in an overwhelming Arab and Islamic region, and they're saying this is not going to last too long. The Crusader state lasted between a century and 2 centuries, depending how you count. It's like Israel's going to be just like the Crusader state. We need to wait them out 1 generation, 5 generations, but at the end of the day, this Zionist aberration in an Arab and Islamic region will disappear. It's just not sustainable. So it's nice to call them delusional or illusions, but they're not. I mean, their vision has as much rationality as our own. So this brings us to the point of why we're stuck. When I did the research on the book, I came across a remarkable speech by Ernst Bevin. the British foreign minister after World War II. As I'm sure you know, he's no friend to the Jewish people. This is the British foreign minister of the Exodus. He doesn't, he hates Zionism. But in February of 1947, he needs to explain to the British Parliament why Britain is betraying the mandate it received from the League of Nations to help the Jews achieve sovereignty. It didn't betray the mandate of the Hashemites. It didn't betray the mandate for Jordan. It didn't betray the mandate for Iraq, but it had betrayed the mandate that was given for the Jewish people. So it needs to explain why it's betraying the mandate and basically throwing it back to the heir of the League of Nations, the United Nations. And he says the following: His Majesty's government has come to the conclusion that the conflict in the land is irreconcilable. He calls it irreconcilable in February of 1947. There's no war yet. There's no partition. There's no refugees. There's no settlements. There's no occupation. None of that. February 1947, already then, he says it's irreconcilable. Why? He says there's two peoples in this land, Jews and Arabs. So there was no question that there were two peoples, two collectives. It's not about religion. These are two nations, two peoples. There's Jews and Arabs. And he says each one of them has a top priority. He calls it the point of principle. It's the one thing that they care about more than anything. The top priority for the Jews, he says, is to have a state. The Jews want a state, that's their top priority. For the Arabs, he says, the top priority is for the Jews not to have a state. Notice the definition of the conflict. Two peoples with two top priorities. The Jews want a state, the Arabs want the Jews not to have a state. By definition, irreconcilable. There's no negotiation here. There's no splitting the difference. And this has been the conflict to the present. Sometimes I call it in even one sentence, a conflict between Jewish Zionism and Arab anti-Zionism. That's it. That's the conflict. Anyone who tells you the conflict is complicated, it's not. Maybe details are complicated, what happened, what in which year, but the essence of the conflict is as simple as could be. Jewish Zionism against Arab anti-Zionism. Now, if this is the conflict, which maybe some of you think is quite depressing, then how does it end? If it's not about the settlement, it's not about the occupation, it's not about land for peace, how are we ever going to end this conflict? And the answer is simple. One of the sides has to give up on their top priority. So either the Jews give up on Zionism, and I can assure you a lot of people around the world are trying to make that happen. So whether the Arabs have tried for decades by wars and terrorism and economic boycotts and international condemnations, the idea is to exhaust the Jews into giving up on Zionism, to get the Jews to say, you know what, not worth it. We're done. We're out of here, or, you know, let's just have one state where we're a Jewish minority and an Arab state where I'm sure it's going to work out. So there's tremendous effort expended for the last century to try to get Jews to give up on their Zionism. The other way that the conflict ends, which is, I think, is much better, is that the Arabs will give up on their anti-Zionism and finally embrace the possibility of a Jewish state in the region. And this is at least what I devote my time to. And certainly in the last 2 years, since the Abraham Accords, I'm much more optimistic that it's at least a possibility. Now, if this is the conflict and this is how it ends, then Israeli politics now becomes more understandable, because the main premise of the Israeli left, the premise that Israel has a path to peace based on the Land for Peace formula, failed spectacularly in the most bloody possible fashion. So it became nearly impossible for any Israeli Jew to believe in the idea that if only Israel tried a little harder, offered a little more land, got rid of more settlements like it did in Gaza, did not occupy the West Bank, then there would be peace. The number of people who believe in that is less than 1 seat in 120 seat Knesset. The idea just failed against empirical reality. So you just couldn't go back to the public and tell them, we want to negotiate with the Palestinians, but it's going to lead nowhere. I mean, that's not a compelling political vision. And as a result, most Israelis have generally just become indifferent to the whole issue. This explains why the previous government, or still the current government, could exist. Naftali Bennett could sit with Meretz and Labor because both of them understood that the Palestinian issue is not facing any decision point. So this is what has led us to the present. This is what has led to the complete collapse of the Israeli left and the entire indifference of the Israeli public to basically what's happening with the Palestinians in the West Bank. Because most Israelis, I mean, it's not that every Israeli went and wrote a book, but most Israelis just looked at reality and understood that as long as Palestinians want from the river to the sea, as long as their top priority is no Jewish state in any borders, then there's really no use negotiating anything. So now we're stuck and we can't end the occupation in an agreement, because any agreement that would leave the Jewish state standing is an agreement that Palestinians will reject, at least so far. We can't just get out of there because Gaza stands as a shining example to what happens when we just withdraw. I personally promote the idea that I call it somewhat provocatively, yes to the occupation, no to the settlements, meaning I don't think we should build settlements. I think it's a totally wasteful project, but the military has to stay in the West Bank because the Palestinians are still at war. And when you have war, then you're justified in a continued occupation. That's what an occupation is. It's how you govern a territory during times of war. But we're stuck. And this is why when some people say the Israeli public has gone to the right, I always say that is absolutely not true. The Israeli public today is in a massive center, which by the way includes, of course, the Likud, where on the one hand, most Israelis are indifferent to the Palestinian issue as long as the Palestinian top priority remains no Jewish state. But also most Israelis understand that if the day comes that the Palestinians come to us and say with a clear voice, not one that requires West-plaining, they say, we, the Palestinians, are ending our century-long war against Zionism. We accept that the Jewish people have an equal and legitimate claim to this land where they have a history. We understand that we will not have all of it and they cannot have all of it. We understand that this means that we will not return or settle inside the state of Israel. We understand that the state of Israel is the Jewish state and will remain the Jewish state, and we will not dispute that. And we now ask the Jewish state to enter into negotiations over the borders between us. At that moment, any Israeli prime minister will say yes. And if there's an Israeli prime minister who will try to say no, he will be immediately replaced, because the vast majority of Israelis understand that at the end of the day, we're a minority in the region. And if we can have true peace that ends the conflict, and the price of that is land, we will pay it. And we will say yes again and again, the same way that we said yes on November 29th, what are we saying, 55 years ago. So let me stop here, and happy to take it in any direction.
Thank you very much. You're clearly quite practiced in presenting points so openly and straightforwardly that it's not possible to hide. And that's great. That's exactly what we were hoping would happen. And so I never ask the first question in these circumstances because then it would become a discussion between us, and that's probably not a good idea. So I am now opening up to the people who are out there, and if anyone wishes to participate and to start with a question, you can just raise your hand the way I just did next to my face, and you can do that on Zoom quite easily. So please start. I can't see all of you on the screen at one time. There are more of you than that, so I need you to have your hands up if you want to participate. Who would like to start? I'm quite patient, you know. I think Einat is also, so we can just wait until someone wants to ask a question or take a position. There are a number of people out there whom I know are capable of doing that. No hands. It can't be that everyone agrees. Ah, Helga Embacher, please. Helga, unmute yourself. Can we see you also? Is that possible? Is there any connection at all? I can't hear you, Helga. Please tell us what you would like to say. Helga? Oh, she muted herself again. Oh, that's no good. Helga Embacher is a contemporary historian and is quite well versed in these things. Try again. No connection. Doesn't seem to be working, Helga. I'm so very sorry. Norley, would you like to jump in?
With a question, yes. Maybe I can ask Einat, what about the right of the Palestinians to return to Israel?
So as we make clear in the book, there is no such right. Fundamentally, if you look at the 20th century, begins when much of the world is divided between empires. The 20th century ends when much of the world is divided between states, mostly nation states. The transition from empire to nation state, mostly based on the principle of self-determination, is a bloody one. It involves 2 world wars, numerous regional wars, civil wars. In the process of those wars, tens of millions of people are displaced, often brutally displaced, many killed. As the empires recede, new borders are delineated, people flee across those borders, are displaced. And generally the message across the 20th century to these tens of millions of refugees has been tough, tragic, move on. And the reason was that it was understood that if there will be a notion that all the people who have been displaced and became refugees would have a right, a legal right, that supersedes the sovereignty of the newly established nations to settle in those nations, that would be endless war. So the notion was that there is no right to settle in a newly sovereign state, even if you lived in that territory before the state was established and you fled or were displaced. There is no right. The state, the newly created state, is sovereign, and like all sovereign state, can now determine who enters. Now, many states accepted refugees, just like Israel, the newly created state of Israel accepted hundreds of thousands of refugees, but all states that accepted refugees did that based on their sovereign interest. They accepted the refugees, typically the ones that belonged to the ethnic or national or religious group that was the majority of the newly created state. So as we explain in the book has a whole chapter explaining why the Palestinians are not special and do not possess a legal right to settle inside Israel in breach of Israeli sovereignty. We explain that even the various resolutions, such as the United Nations General Assembly Resolution, which 194, which Palestinians cite as giving them a right, does not give them such right. So the Palestinians have no such right. We explain why the Palestinians were indulged by the West for decades in believing that they have a right, in believing that they are refugees. The book goes into that in detail, especially highlighting in the 50s, the Cold War, the oil, the rising oil, the fear of the West that the Arab states might go to the Soviet Union. So there was a willingness to look the other way from the Palestinian insistence that the war of 1948 is not over, and therefore they refuse to be settled as refugees. And that's also one of the things that we show in the book. It's not about leaders. We sometimes take comfort in the idea that the Palestinian people only want peace and the leaders are corrupt and extreme. If anything, it's the other way around. Because their leaders are corrupt, they were often a little more moderate. The Palestinian people, already the Arab refugees themselves, already in the 50s, refuse any kind of settlement, any kind of accommodation that would improve their lives, if the price of that means that they need to understand that the war of 1948 is over. They are adamant that the war of 1948 is not over, that the Jewish state cannot be allowed to stand, cannot be considered legitimate, and the West, for its own reasons, indulges them in creating a kind of institutional loophole called UNRWA that creates this notion that generation after generation, Palestinians can believe that they are refugees from a war that ended 70 years ago, that they have a right of return. But it's actually, there's no such right, there's no legal basis for it. They are not refugees by any international standard. We show in the book, and for a minute, I'll just go through it, the Palestinian identity of themselves as perpetual refugees from the war of 1948 is the most important element of the Palestinian identity. To be a Palestinian is essentially to be an endless refugee waiting for the state of Israel to disappear. That's the essence of the identity. So in terms of what it means to who they are, it's the most important thing. In terms of what it means in practice, it's actually very small. UNRWA registers today about 5.8 million refugees. 40% of them live in the West Bank and Gaza, so they live in Palestine. Almost all of them by now are second, third, fourth, fifth generation, so they've been born in Palestine. They've never been displaced by war. Most of them don't even live in the refugee neighborhoods. Those are not camps anymore, they're neighborhoods, they're settled places. So you could have a middle-class lawyer in Ramallah, you have them, who was born in Ramallah, is middle-class, never displaced by war, but is registered as a refugee from Palestine. So it's not a real problem. He doesn't need to be resettled. So there's no real problem. Where they are is where they will be, but it's a matter of identity. Another 40% live in Jordan. They're Jordanian citizens. To the credit of Jordan, Jordan was willing at one point to make peace with Israel. And you can see that the country that wanted to make peace also didn't demand return. Return was an act of war. Demanding return was an act of war. But then the Palestinians went and assassinated the Jordanian king because he was willing to make peace with Israel, and that became an issue. But 40% of those who are registered as refugees are Jordanian citizens. Almost none of them live in the refugee neighborhoods. They're middle class, upper class, going all over the Middle East. And they're not refugees by any international standard. So that's already more than 80%. The remaining 20%, about 1 million, are registered in Syria and Lebanon. We know from data that most of them have left Syria and Lebanon over the years. My favorite refugee is the multimillionaire father of supermodels Gigi and Bella Hadid. He lives in America. He has an American citizenship. He's a multimillionaire. He's not a refugee by any international standard. And yet he's still registered on UNRWA books in Syria as a refugee because they don't take anyone off their books ever. So the actual number of people who are not in Palestine, don't have citizenship, have not settled elsewhere. So those who are still in Lebanon and Syria and are discriminated against, have been denied citizenship for generations. The numbers of those are about 250,000. Those are numbers that the real Organization for Refugees, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, knows how to settle. So the actual Palestinian refugee problem is small. The idea of the Palestinians as eternal refugees until the day that Israel disappears is at the core of their identity. And a lot of what the book is about is, yes, we offer policies to solve the actual problem, but we also talk about policies of putting an end to the Western indulgence of this identity of perpetual refugees.
Thank you very much. Antonia Rice has a question or perhaps a statement.
Yeah, thank you so much. Hello, everyone, and thank you for your presentation and your really interesting answer now. I have a more practical question about your book, like methodology-wise. How did you and your co-author, and you've touched upon it in your answer, how did you go get the Palestinian perspective? Is it more an analysis of what we see, what we've all seen, them rejecting peace deals? Or I haven't read your book yet, unfortunately, but maybe you can tell me about it. Or is it also you interviewing Palestinians? Or how did you go about it from the point of view of sources? How did you get to the Palestinian voice, to what Palestinian wants, methodologically? I hope you get what I mean by it. Thank you so much for your answer.
So one of the things that I'm most proud of in this book is that the book gives the Palestinians the respect of taking them at their word. So the book is heavily researched all the way back to the 40s and before. I can tell you that by now the book has appeared in several languages, read by many, many people. There has been no kind of criticism of the research of the book. If anything, I can say that when the book came out in English, there was a Palestinian scholar who reviewed the book. And of course, he was quite angry about our recommendations to end the Western support for UNRWA. He was angry about our claim that there's no right of return. But in terms of the main thesis of the book, that no Jewish state via the mechanism of return is the top Palestinian priority, basically his message was, seriously? It took 2 Israeli researchers several years to realize what we've been saying all along. It was basically like, I can't believe that, 2 Israelis just published a book and we're saying this all the time. When the book came out, the book recently got a prize in Israel for security studies, which I really like because, there are no tanks or airplanes in the book, but they understood that the most important thing in security studies is to understand what your enemy is fighting for, what their priority, what they believe in. So in the audience were 2 Druze officers. I'm sure you know the Druze are a small Arabic-speaking Muslim sect that because of their status are loyal to whichever state they live in. They serve in the Israeli military. So there were two Druze officers in the audience. At the end of the presentation, the prize presentations, they come to us and say, congratulations, we found the two Israeli Jews who finally understand what the conflict is about. The Arabs keep telling you all the time, and you're not getting it into your head. Now, so in addition to the research and the methodology, and everything is super rigorous in the book and has not been criticized for that, you know, I often meet groups, and like you said, I speak very clearly, and I'm not hiding, and I'm not kind of like trying to make it sound nice. And a lot of people tell me, look, this can't be what the Palestinians believe. There must be a lot of different Palestinians who believe a lot of different things. And I tell them, look, I made your job super easy. I just opened myself to the easiest criticism in the world. Go, bring me a Palestinian who will openly say, write an op-ed, a tweet, a YouTube video, but it has to be public. It has to be in their own words. Because the one thing I'm done doing is listening to Westerners telling me what Palestinians think. This is the West-plaining thing. I don't trust Westerners anymore to explain what Palestinians say. So I'm like, I want to hear in the voice of a Palestinian, an op-ed, a YouTube video, a tweet, anything that says clearly, we have been mistaken in demanding return for 70 years. It's not going to happen. We need to move on for that. The Jewish people have an equally legitimate claim to this land. We need to divide it with them, and we need to understand that there will be no return, and we need to prepare our people for that. Anything around that issue. But it needs to be clear. I don't want any Westerner to West-plaining for me and to say, no, they said this, but they actually mean that. I can assure you, no one has yet come back with that. I'll tell you even more. About a year ago, I met with one of the top congressional Democrats. He read the book, he loved it, and I was in a meeting with him in Jerusalem, a long meeting, and two of his assistants were there. And at one point he said, but there must be Palestinians who think differently, maybe the young generation. And I told him, unfortunately not. If anything, the young generation is even more radical. And his assistant, hearing me say that, said, oh, thank you so much. My boss, who's this very optimistic person, my boss keeps sending me to search for Palestinian moderates, and I never find them. And I was like, yeah, because they don't exist. Or so all I'm saying, I've made anyone who wants to prove me wrong, I've made their life super easy. And that's basically, so as I said, the book is very rigorous on research. It's all about taking the Palestinians' words. We analyze the Palestinian papers, decades of speeches, decisions, quotes. It's all about what the Palestinians are saying. But also to the present, I always tell people, bring me those who will speak differently. That's what I want. The day that they will speak differently is the day we have peace. So I want that.
I'm going to intervene now because, as all of us know, it isn't just about West-splaining. It's about the continuous repetition by the Western powers that they are for a two-state solution. They never quite say what that will be, or when they are asked what they mean by that, you get different answers. But the basic, it's like a mantra. They just keep saying two-state solution, two-state solution. And so for me, this is also a policy question. Why do they keep doing that?
It's one of the questions that still in many ways remains shrouded in mystery for us. Because as you can see also from my thinking, and also in the book we highlighted, this is entirely illogical. On the one hand, the West keeps on saying that they want a two-state solution. And in the name of that policy, some states recognize Palestine. All Western states speak against Israeli settlements. They help the Palestinian Authority. They promote state-building efforts. They're very clear that a two-state solution means that there needs to be a state of Palestine with no settlements, and it ends the occupation. So they're very clear on those issues, but then they fund to more than $1 billion a year. That's the money that Western governments give to UNRWA every year. They fund to $1 billion the one organization that keeps alive for Palestinians the vision that one day Israel will not exist. So it is about the least logical policy that you can have. And we can understand in the 1950s why they wanted to look away, and we talk about their consideration. And then our explanation was like, okay, then it became a matter of inertia. They just kept paying the money without even thinking about it. But when you present them with it, I can tell you, for example, Adi and I have had numerous meetings by now with Western diplomats. We go to Brussels, right, the heart of darkness. We go to the place where they fund UNRWA. We meet with the official responsible for the EU funding for UNRWA. He's German by his nationality, but he works for the EU. Adi and I present the situation for about an hour. And at the end, he looks at us as if entertaining the thought for the first time. And he says this at this pace. So you want to tell me that the reason we still don't have peace is that Palestinians still want all of it? And you could see that he was surprised by the thought. And Adi and I were like, yeah. But of course, the next day he continues funding UNRWA. So the explanation that I have at this point is that a lot of Western, when I was recently in Norway, I said it to them, it was like a lot of Western policymaking is about feeling good, but not so much about doing good. So people in the foreign policy establishments of most Western nations, they want to feel good. And helping the poor Palestinians, funding UNRWA, it feels good. But it doesn't do good. It literally extends the war for another generation. The guy in Brussels doesn't pay for it. I pay for it in another generation of war and more blood and rockets and terrorist attacks in another generation of Palestinians who believe that they need to fight the state of Israel until it disappears. So we pay for it in blood in another generation of conflict, but they get to feel good about themselves. If they were actually interested in doing good, rather than just feeling good, they would have to do some things that are not pleasant. They would have to tell the Palestinians, the war of 1948 is over. And here I'm going to say something that sounds really tough. Insofar that your goal in that war was to prevent a Jewish state from being established, you lost. And you have to move on and accept it. And you're not refugees. This was the 20th century, and you're not special. It's tragic, it's sad, and you need to move on. We will not give you $1 or €1 as long as your vision is from the river to the sea. Come back to us when your vision is an Arab state next to a Jewish state, and you no longer demand return. And you no longer think you are refugees into the 5th generation living in Ramallah. When you're ready, we're here and we're happy to support you. But until then, we're gone. Now, nobody wants to say that. That doesn't feel good. But this is what will do good. And in parentheses, I will say, amazingly, the voices that are willing to say that to the Palestinians are increasingly Arab voices, not Western voices. You're finding more and more Arab voices that have had it with 70 years, 75 years of fighting Israel. And they just want to be done. They want to close the book on the war of 1948. And they understand what needs to be said to make that happen.
Quite fascinating, of course, because the line for many years, as you know, was that the Arab states were using the Palestinians. And you're making it sound like it's the other way around.
Oh, no, they were definitely using them. There's no understanding the ability of the Palestinians to say no for 100 years, really, without the fact that they had Arab support. If the Israeli-Palestinian conflict was really the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, that conflict was over in April 1948. In April 1948, the Jews and Arabs, the fighting between the Jews and Arabs is pretty much settled. The lines are settled. A month later, when the British leave, it becomes the Arab-Israeli conflict when 7 Arab armies make war. And the Arab states have sustained the Palestinian war against Israel for decades. But precisely because some Arab states, not all, but some Arab states now have different priorities, they no longer have use for the Palestinians. And that's why they're telling them, we're done. We no longer need you to be the vanguard fighting against the invading crusaders because we have other priorities now. So yeah, it's exactly that.
One last question, since I haven't seen any other hands, perhaps you can have some more discussion also. But anyway, one question of the last one I really wanted to ask about. You've already touched upon this in passing, was the question of time perspective. Dan Diener, decades ago, wrote a book about this in German, about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the left, the German left. There was a very different analysis, but and it was a long time ago. But the point that's relevant here was his point that whereas the Israelis, mainly coming from Western cultures, tend to have a long-term time perspective when it comes to values, but a short-term time perspective when it comes to actually concrete deal making. And that's why there's always so much frustration. You know, we're offering such a great deal. Why aren't they taking it? And so Dan's analysis back then was the Palestinians have an Ewigkeits perspective, a forever perspective, which is why they can tolerate failure in the short term because it doesn't matter in the long term in their view. Do you agree with that?
Certainly. I mean, sometimes I joke that basically it's not a joke, but it's kind of sad, but that the entire conflict is a mutual war of exhaustion. Basically, the Palestinians and their Arab backers and anyone else, their Western backers, are trying to exhaust the Jews to give up on Zionism. And we are trying to exhaust the Arabs to give up on their anti-Zionism. Now, it's true that when they look at us, they have a different time perspective. It's not a coincidence that one of the parallels that is most brought against Israel is the idea of the Crusader state. The Crusader state lasted 88 years. If you include Jerusalem, let's say without Jerusalem, maybe 200 years. As far as the Palestinians are concerned, this is not forever. That's like, you know, Israel's now about to celebrate 75 years. So within a generation, they can imagine Israel disappearing, or let's say another 5 generations. So yeah, in their perspective, they need to wait us out. And as I said, it's not irrational. And therefore they say, we're not going to compromise, because why should we compromise with something that is clearly has limited time? And you have, you know, Naftali Bennett just wrote in the New York Times a piece about his government and all that. And he says this thing, you know, this is the 3rd effort of the Jews to have sovereignty. Each one began to kind of crumble after 80 years. So when Palestinians and Arabs read that, they're like, yeah, we're close. You know, we don't have to wait much longer. So from their perspective, they don't need to wait forever. They just need to wait a few more generations. But from their perspective, totally worth it.
Of course, this also brings up the issue of what's taught in Palestinian schools, which is
Yeah, I mean,
continually raised as an argument against them, but nobody actually makes a concrete proposal about how to change it.
oh, and if I may say, the entire discourse on books is good for like scoring points, but it's useless. I mean, let's say tomorrow, all the Palestinians receive the most pro-Zionist books, okay? What's going to happen? The teachers are also in their mind refugees. The teachers are going to enter the class and will say, dear students, please close the books. And we will tell you about the time when my great-grandfather lived in Palestine and the Zionists stole it from them. That's what, I mean, they're going to teach it regardless of what's in the books, because this is their foundational ethos and identity. The Emirates, the UAE, after it signed the Abraham Accords, 2 weeks later, changed the books. You change the books after you decide to change your priorities. But as long as the entire Palestinian ethos is that their role is, their duty is to fight this Zionist state until it disappears, that's what they're going to teach. And it doesn't matter if Europe is going to force them to like change some phrases in the books. They need to change who they are. They need to change their priorities. So these days, I call myself a long-term optimist, because just giving Palestinians land is not going to end the conflict. They need to go through the very difficult process of changing their very identity, of changing their priorities, of thinking of themselves not as a people devoted to anti-Zionism, but as a people devoted to building their own state next to the Jewish state. They are not going to go through this process as long as they are indulged in believing that their cause is just, which is why we're saying they need to stop being indulged. It doesn't guarantee, but at least so that they can start the process of changing their priorities away from anti-Zionism towards a constructive vision of building a Palestinian state next to Israel rather than instead of Israel.
Does contradict the claims often being advanced also in the Israeli media that the two-state solution is dead anyway, and that it's going to be a one-state solution.
So let me put that to bed. The Palestinians like to tell the story, and there's an interest of both Palestinians and right-wing people to say, the settlements killed the two-state solution. So from the Palestinian perspective, it's a way of saying we really, really wanted the two-state solution, but look at Israel, they built all these settlements, and now we want a one-state solution. And my answer is like, they never, ever wanted a two-state solution in the sense of a Jewish state and an Arab state, right? When you say you support a two-state solution, but you insist on return, then the only two states you've ever supported was a Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza and another Palestinian state to replace Israel. There was never a moment, not a single moment, where the Palestinian vision of peace was an Arab state next to a Jewish state. So there was never that moment. So from their perspective, a one state is what they've always wanted, where the Jews would quickly become a minority, bow down their heads, but that's it. That's what they've always wanted. It's not as if they suddenly had this realization. Right-wingers in Israel have an interest in saying that settlements have made this impossible because they know, and they've seen it again and again. They saw it with the fact that no one wants annexation and prefers flights to Dubai, what happened with getting out of Gaza. The vast majority of Israeli Jews don't care for the settlement project and would drop it in a heartbeat in exchange for true peace. Settlers know that. So they want to present their project as a success, and not as the failure that it actually is. 55 years after Israel controls the West Bank, the total territory of the settlements is about 3-4%, mostly next to the Green Line. The same kind of Palestinian state that was possible in the 90s is possible today. This, as much as I do not support the settlement project, I think it's been Israel's most wasteful project by far. This is not the reason we don't have peace. The only, an absolute only reason we don't have peace based on a two-state solution is that the Palestinians remain committed to anti-Zionism, to the idea of no Jewish state in any borders. Someone wrote to me a couple of days ago, he said, but the Palestinians will say that they don't have a partner. And I said, yes, that's true. As long as the Palestinians want no Jewish state, they do not have a partner in us. That's why Bevin called it an irreconcilable conflict. We have two irreconcilable top priorities. We are each other, not partners for each other, given that the irreconcilable top priorities. So what we're trying to do is exhaust the other side to give up on their top priority. There's just no other way.
So what about the talk of annexation, which it was said Netanyahu almost did?
So this was also a great moment to show where Israeli priorities really are. When everyone talked about annexation, first of all, remember, people forget the entire talk of the annexation was actually in the context of Netanyahu saying yes to a two-state solution, which was the Trump plan. You might think that the Palestinian state that the Trump plan offered was not fair, was too small, but don't overlook the fact that it was in the context of saying yes to a Palestinian state and to the Trump plan, and then saying that Israel should annex the 20% that is not going to be the Palestinian state. But even for those 20%, when the Emiratis basically wrote in an op-ed to Israelis, how about you drop those discussions of annexation and you get direct flights to Dubai? What did Israelis do? They were like, yeah, we want direct flights to Dubai, and we really don't care about annexing 20 or 30% of the West Bank. So yeah, there were 5 settlers who said, oh, what a terrible loss of opportunity. But most Israelis could not be happier with direct flights for Dubai. And again, Israel doesn't get credit for the fact that again and again and again, the priorities of Israelis are very clear. If we can live in peace in the region, and the price of that is a smaller state of Israel, it is a price that we accept and we will pay. So annexation is gone, it's off the table. There's actually a lot of interesting analysis from left-wing circles that, very extreme left-wing circles, that precisely because annexation is off the table, precisely because this government had an Arab party, so getting closer to a vision of Israeli Arabs being not just equal citizens, but equal governors, partners in power, that the extreme right has an interest in kind of fomenting violence in order to prevent those directions. But even if you accept that analysis, it means that the Israeli right understands that most Israeli public is not there. And again, in that, Bevin was correct. Our priority was always a Jewish state. Controlling every square centimeter of biblical land was not our priority ever.
Still, I'm not seeing any hands, which is unfortunate because I really do want other people to ask questions, but I have one last one.
Yeah.
And that is about the sustainability of the occupation. As you know, there have been commentaries for a long time now about how the choice was between continuing the occupation and undermining the rule of law in all of Israel, or giving up the occupation for the sake of maintaining, shall we say, real Zionism or a pure legal state in the remainder of Israel. But this talk has gone on so long that it makes one wonder whether there was ever a subject matter there. There's plenty of commentaries about soldiers who do feel traumatized, or at the very least deeply disturbed by having done duty in the territories. So there's some plausibility to this analysis, it would seem.
So first of all, generally, those comments they continuously say that, this is not sustainable and it continues to sustain itself. The reason being, again, that most Israelis understand why the occupation continues. Most Israelis understand that, one of the things that is one of the biggest fallacies when it comes to the conflict, and especially the occupation, is reversal of cause and effect. The notion that, okay, the Arab world hates us because of the occupation, but it's exactly reversal of cause and effect. Israel came into military occupation and possession of the West Bank and Gaza because the Arab world hated Israel before, was anti-Zionist before, refused to make peace with Israel before, went to another war in 1967 in order to undo the Jewish state and lost again. So the initial cause of Israel getting into the West Bank has to do with the Arab rejection of Zionism. So it cannot be the cause, it's actually the outcome. But even the inability to end the occupation, which by now is 55 years, is because every time we try to end it in an agreement with the Palestinians, they walked away because they are not going to say yes to any agreement that allows the state of Israel within the pre-19 in any borders to stay. And even when we try to do it unilaterally with Gaza, it's not a model that a lot of people want to replicate in the West Bank. So we are genuinely stuck. And serving in the military, and I can assure you people were traumatized by the Yom Kippur War and the 67 War and the Independence War. Yes, having to sustain a Jewish sovereign state against extreme violence and rejection has taken a toll. And the occupation is part of that. It's the fact that there is a complete rejection of any agreement that would allow the Jewish state to remain. So people come up with ideas like shrinking the conflict, or as I said, I promote the idea of no to the settlements, yes to the occupation, or things of the sort. Most Israelis have just become indifferent, but we're stuck. We're stuck because, again, our priorities are irreconcilable. We want a state, they want us not to have a state. We're stuck. Now, it's true that some people are giving up. Some people are saying, some people have been exhausted and they say, it's not worth it. It's not all this fighting, all that we need to do to sustain a Jewish state is not worth it. So you have a certain diasporic ideology. I reject it completely, but yeah, there are some people who are exhausted by the continuous toll of having to fight to sustain a Jewish state.
Last question. What can you possibly tell the left in its current situation? It's the selection was such a disaster. It seems hard to imagine that the existing left parties could possibly recover. So do you see new left parties emerging?
So for a while, the left parties tried to focus more on domestic issues, bring back socialism, feminism, labor unions, and that made it into a small niche party. I would be all in favor of going full on to say Israel needs a clear border, eastern border. By now we have borders almost all around, but a clear eastern border in the West Bank. We need to end the settlement project. The army might have to continue to stay there for a long time until the Palestinians end their century-long war against Zionism, but we can't wait for them. We need to define our final eastern border. We need to know who's in, who's out. I've tried to promote it. Sometimes I joke that I don't know if I represent the 5 people in Israel that agree with me, and they're all my friends by now, or 80% of the Israeli public. But that would be my priority for what Israel needs. And at one point, these ideas might become relevant again. If the extreme right-wingers are successful in fomenting violence and, getting Jews and Arabs to have violence all over, then I think there might be again a desire among many Jews to say, okay, let's just draw a line and make it clear that we're not there and we're here, and we'll just, however long it takes them to be exhausted of their anti-Zionism, we'll wait. I see a young man with a hand, so I don't know if you want me to do that as the last question.
Balázs Berkowitz, please.
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you for this very clear and very rational presentation. And so you say that there's no right-wing turn of the Israeli public, and I really want to agree with that. But still, we just had the elections, and so this new incoming right-wing government was elected, even though the majorities was not crystal clear, and we know that it's not a clear majority in terms of electoral votes, but still. So aren't you afraid of the possibility that this kind of government will enact things that will not be that the maybe future governments will not be able to undo, so that they will reach a point of no return in terms of applying sovereignty to the territories, annexation, and so on and so forth, and the violence that they are susceptible to nurturing?
I'll end with this, with a few scenarios. So the only truly right-wing elements in the Israeli electoral are those that are represented by religious Zionism. And even there, if you begin to analyze the motivations, the ideologue right-wing, probably less than 10% of the Israeli population. The Likud is clearly centrist. I'll tell you a little anecdote, but it's also, if you analyze it, it's true. When the book came out in Hebrew, I talked about the book and I continuously said, I'm left-wing, I'm still left-wing. In Hebrew, you say smolani. So a woman comes up to me at the end of the talk and she says, you keep on saying that you're smolanit, that you're left-wing, but you don't sound like one. And I told her, so in what sense are you a left-wing? And I said, look, at the end of the day, I believe that there are two peoples, nations, Jews and Arabs. Whatever they think about each other, they violently agree that they're not the other. They do not form a single people. They're two distinct peoples. They both have a connection here, and I think they both would be served best by governing themselves in two separate political units. So in that sense, I support partition, I support division if the Palestinians end their century-long war against Zionism. And she said, but I believe the same thing, and I'm from the Likud. So fundamentally, the vast majority of Israelis is in this, I call it the centrist blob, where most have become entirely indifferent to the Palestinian issue, which is why you think we're right-wing, because we don't care. But we don't care because we realize there's no use in caring. They want from the river to the sea. We want to have our state. We're stuck. So, but it doesn't make us right-wing. It just makes us people who understand that we're stuck. But the same people will agree to divide the land if it will be for true peace. These are the same people who, as I said, agreed to the Trump plan, dropped annexation for the Abraham Accords. Those have always been the Jewish priorities within the state of Israel. The real ideologues at the end of the day do not have the majority, the support of the Israeli majority, and they know that. Now, this is where we can look at some troubling scenarios. So you have positive scenarios where they moderate and they understand it. And that's what I say, at the end of the day, the Jews are a tiny minority in an Arab and Islamic Middle East. You could be as right-wing as you want, but you're going to ultimately bump against this undeniable reality. And that's going to force even the most right-wing ideologues into dealing with that clear fact. But are they going to, so you have a positive scenario where they bump against reality, they moderate. like every right-wing person in Israel in history, or there's a scenario where they foment violence. Now, even in that scenario, at the end of the day, we come back to reality, which is the Jews are a small minority in an Arab Middle East, which means we will always have to compromise, but we want to make sure that the compromise is for true peace. But the concern is just the human cost in the process. So, you know, sometimes you have nations go through violence and wars only to go back to square one. It's probably what's going to happen in Ukraine at one point. But, you know, some nations again and again go through violence and wars. But because the reality is so powerful, they end up going to square one. And that's a concerning, this is not an optimistic scenario, because even if ultimately reality will force everyone to contend with it, there might be a very high price to pay in the process. And I'm not even talking about other right-wing issues such as religion and state, feminism, gay rights. A lot of my concerns with this new government are domestic, not so much foreign policy. As I said, in foreign policy, I think reality is too powerful. In domestic policy, that's where more of my concerns are. Okay.
Be lovely to deepen that part of the discussion even further, but our time is indeed over. And I think you've given all of us food for thought, and we will spread the word that your book is worth looking at, and especially since it's now in German, more people will perhaps actually do that.
Wonderful.
Thank you very much for your presentation and for being so lively and eloquent. But that's who you are. So it's that's really the way we want it, and we're very happy that you were willing to spend some time with us.
Certainly. Thank you. It's been a pleasure.